Welcome back to Traveling Dice. I'm Jason. I have part 2 of the massive castle build for you today, and we're actually going to get our hands on it and start building this thing. And this is the last portion here that's going to be done outside of the classroom, which is prepping that MDF base that I got at Home Depot. So I originally bought a 4-foot by 8-foot section. This is a massive section, but they cut it at the store for me. So I had them cut one length so that one side was already cut, and I just had to do the cross cut. So I measure that out and I get it cut. I'm using a circular saw here, and I do want to point out, don't use any tools that you don't feel comfortable using. So if you're new to power tools and you are trying to do stuff like this, it is really critical that you watch a bunch of safety videos, that you reach out to someone that you know who's familiar with the tools, because with these types of power tools, you can definitely injure yourself. So be mindful of that if you haven't used them before. But I get the piece cut, and I cut the remaining pieces so that I can store them for future projects. So the next thing I do is bevel the edges of the piece that I now have cut to its proper size. And I'm going to angle the circular saw so that it's cutting at an angle, and I'm drawing a line that I'm going to follow, and it's just essentially right there on that edge. But if I follow that line, I'm going to have a relatively straight cut. It being absolutely straight isn't super critical because I do have a little bit of play. I have a little bit of extra space in the size of the board and the size of the castle, which makes sense. You don't necessarily want the castle going right up to the edge. Now, I would say beveling the edges is an option. So beveling is just when you either cut off or sand off a portion where it kind of comes to a curve instead of coming to an abrupt 90-degree end. If you're only displaying this as like a diorama, I don't think beveling the edges is necessary. It may not even be better. You could just have a decorative, like flat black edge going all the way around your diorama. So if it's solely being displayed, I think that's a great route to go, and I wouldn't bother beveling the edges. For me, in addition to having this being displayed as a classroom piece, I also want to have the option of taking it home on a weekend and using it in a tabletop war game like Warhammer or a D&D scenario. And in those specific uses, I think it's much better to have the edges beveled, because then as you start to incorporate it in with the battlefield and the battle mat and other terrain, it just is going to look a lot cleaner if those edges are beveled, as opposed to coming to the sharp 90-degree edge. So this involves me making 4 cuts. They're essentially 4 identical cuts, and I'm drawing the straight line and just following the line across as I'm making the cut. Once I have these cuts made, I do hit each edge with the random orbital sander just to make sure that everything's kind of smoothed out, especially those corners, right? When you do cuts like this, the corner is going to have a strong point to it. So I do focus the sander on that corner. But then get this piece nice and ready to actually start putting the castle on. So we actually get to the assembly of the castle pieces, which is really exciting to actually start to see this idea come to fruition and start to get the students more involved in this process. Initially, we start to use tacky glue while we're putting these things together. I like tacky glue in that you can start using it immediately. There's no warm-up process. It has some advantages over hot glue. If you see something's not quite right, after a few minutes, you still can move it around a bit. So it has that benefit, whereas hot glue is going to set very quickly, which is one of the reasons why you might want to use hot glue, but it's also kind of a downside. Like if you realize you made an error, your window for correcting that error with hot glue is very slight. Whereas with the tacky glue, you have 5 minutes, 10 minutes for sure. Maybe even longer potentially before it's hard to move the piece around. Now, one of the downsides with tacky glue on a project like this is that it's more prone to warping. And that's really difficult when you're dealing with cardboard, because cardboard as a material is prone to warping. So we do start with the tacky glue while assembling the pieces, but then quickly shift over to the hot glue, which was really superior for this. But most of the base here that you're seeing is built with the tacky glue. So we're starting out with the base, which makes sense, right? Start at the bottom, work your way up, and we are just assembling these pieces. We do have within this big base some pieces that are the same height that are going across. And I think this is important because it's going to support the platform that's going on top of it. And you don't want that just supported on the perimeter. You want that also supported in the middle of the piece. So we do have those, and we're mindful that they're the same height. In addition to that, we start building the 4 towers here. Now, if you have a cutting mat, the cutting mat is a really useful tool to make sure that the pieces are going together at a 90-degree angle. So if you're gluing 2 pieces together on the cutting mat, you can just make sure that you're holding them in an area where they're lining up on 2 spots that are going to be in a 90-degree angle. The other thing is, if your measurements are really exact when you're gluing 2 pieces of cardboard together, you will need to trim off the thickness of the cardboard, which I did, trying to keep it true to the plans. But I don't think it's critical. If it gets whatever the thickness of your cardboard is, if it's 1/4 of an inch, that's probably fine. And then it's just off. The stones almost certainly aren't going to line up anyways. So in retrospect, I probably would have just ignored this and not bothered trimming the pieces. We traced the base portion with all the inner supports onto the MDF base. And then after we traced it, we removed the base, and then we knew exactly where to put glue. We saw the lines of all our contact points, and we put, now in this case, I think tacky glue is way better because you have so many spots that you're trying to glue that doing that with the hot glue would have been an absolute nightmare. There's the lines that we traced, and then we simply go in and we just tacky glue all those areas, press our base down. So at this point, the base of the castle is actually attached to the MDF base. At this point, we hit the corners where the 2 sections meet with additional tacky glue. We use these 3x5 cards to mark where our towers are going to overlap with the base of the castle. And then we trace that section onto the tower so we know what portion we need to remove. And we simply cut out that portion so that the tower then that we built as a solid individual piece could now sit on the corner of the castle as it should. Tracing those sections is much better than trying to measure it because there's so many opportunities to make an error when you measure, but if you trace it and then cut it, it should fit exactly. We applied a generous amount of tacky glue on all the contact points where the platform portion that's going to sit on top of it is going to be placed. Once we have glue all over those points, we place the 2 platform pieces. Now, these we wanted weighed down in order to let these dry thoroughly. So what we did was we used some of our textbooks sitting on top to weigh it down while the tacky glue dried, and we left that for at least an hour. We then did a similar process, adding the 4 towers onto the corners of the castle, using the textbooks again to weigh it down, letting those sit for about an hour as well. The 2 towers adjacent to the main entrance were done in a very similar manner, following the same steps. It's just a slightly smaller scale. Then we started to build the platforms up from there. Now the blueprints call for that center section at that level to be 9.75 inches in height. But looking at the cardboard once we were getting ready to place it, it was too big. So we did bring that down so that it was closer to 6.75 inches, so a little bit smaller there. And actually during this same step, we were able to add that 3rd platform section, and then we get to see it all dry here and set up. So at this point, it's really set up very well for the stones. None of the roofs, pitch roofs, have been added yet. We're going to add those on after the stones get it kind of up to that level so we get a better sense of the exact dimensions. You see the buttress pieces there on the back, and there's the frame all set, ready to go for the stones. So we hope that you enjoyed this part 2 of this massive castle build. And we should see in about a week for part 3 as we start to actually put the stones on and this thing really starts to take shape. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did and you know someone else that would like it, please share it with them. Bye for now.